The old wooden chest sat gathering dust in the corner of the attic for as long as anyone could remember. It belonged to Aunt Rose, a quiet woman with kind eyes who rarely spoke about her past. Nobody paid much attention to it until the day after her funeral, when her niece found a small brass key taped to the back of a faded photograph. The spring air was thick with pollen as the family gathered at the old farmhouse. Rose had lived there for over 50 years, her presence gentle but somehow always slightly removed, as if part of her existed elsewhere. Her niece, Beth, had been closest to her in those final years, stopping by with homemade soup and fresh flowers, listening to Rose's stories about her garden and the changing seasons. But Beth always sensed there was something Rose wasn't saying. A shadow that sometimes passed over her face when certain topics came up. A way she'd change the subject when conversations veered toward her younger years. "Take whatever you want from the house," Rose had told Beth a month before she passed. "But promise me you'll look through everything carefully." At the time, Beth thought it was just the sentimental request of an elderly woman. Now, standing in the dusty attic with the key in her hand, she wondered if there had been more to it. The photograph had been tucked inside Rose's Bible. It showed a much younger Rose standing beside a tall pine tree, her hair flowing loose in a way Beth had never seen it. Written on the back in faded ink, "Remember to look behind the memories. The key opens more than just a lock." Beth turned the small brass key over in her palm. It seemed too delicate for any normal door. That's when she remembered the wooden chest. The family was downstairs, sorting through Rose's belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. Beth could hear her cousins laughing about something in the kitchen, the normalcy of it all a stark contrast to the mystery that was building in her mind. The chest wasn't large, maybe 2 feet across and a foot deep. Its wood had darkened with age, and brass fittings wrapped around its edges like protective hands. The lock was small, almost hidden against the front panel. Beth knelt before it, suddenly hesitant, as if opening it might somehow be a betrayal of Rose's privacy. But hadn't Rose left her the key? Hadn't she asked Beth to look through everything? The key fit perfectly. It turned with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet attic. Beth lifted the lid slowly, half expecting something dramatic to happen. Inside, she found layers of carefully packed items, each wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with time. On top was an envelope addressed simply to "The Finder." Beth's hands trembled slightly as she opened it and began to read. "If you're reading this, then I've finally found the courage to lead someone to my past, even if I couldn't speak of it while I lived. Some secrets aren't meant to be buried forever, though I kept this one for 30 years before even writing these words. What you'll find in this chest is the story I couldn't tell, the life I left behind, and the truth that might change how you see me. But it's time. Truth has a way of demanding to be known, even after those who kept it have gone. Start with the blue notebook at the bottom. Everything else will make sense after that." Beth set the letter aside, her heart beating faster. She carefully removed each item from the chest, laying them out on the attic floor. There were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. Several small jewelry boxes. A man's pocket watch. Photographs of people Beth had never seen before. News clippings from a town she didn't recognize. And at the bottom, just as the letter had said, a blue notebook with a worn leather cover. The first page bore a date from 1958 and an opening line that made Beth gasp, "Today I became someone else." Downstairs, someone called her name. "Just a minute," Beth answered, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. She quickly gathered everything and placed it back in the chest, taking only the notebook and the letter. Whatever secret Aunt Rose had kept for 3 decades, Beth suddenly felt she needed privacy to discover it. That evening, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Beth sat on Rose's porch swing with a cup of tea and the blue notebook. The same swing where Rose had spent countless evenings watching sunsets, sometimes with a faraway look in her eyes that Beth now realized might have been longing. The notebook's pages were filled with neat handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. As Beth began to read, the woman she thought she knew began to transform into someone with a past so different from anything she could have imagined. "Today I became someone else," the journal began. "I left behind everything I knew. My name, my home, my history. The person who boards the train tomorrow morning will look like me, but she'll carry different identification, answer to a different name, and begin a completely new life hundreds of miles away. I've memorized my new details until they feel as natural as the truth. I am now Rose Miller. I was born in Cincinnati. My parents died when I was young. I'm moving west to start fresh after nursing school. I have no siblings. No close friends. No connections to anyone who might recognize the person I used to be." Beth stopped reading for a moment, trying to process what she was seeing. Aunt Rose, the woman who had baked cookies for every family gathering, who had tended her garden with quiet dedication, who had lived such a seemingly simple and transparent life, had been living under a false identity? It seemed impossible. The next pages detailed Rose's journey to what would become her home for the next 50 years. She described changing buses 3 times to avoid being tracked. She mentioned discarding certain items that might connect her to her previous life. She wrote about the terror of being recognized and the constant vigilance required to maintain her new identity. But nowhere in those first pages did she explain why. What had happened that was so terrible that she needed to completely disappear? Who was she running from? And who had she been before she became Aunt Rose? As the twilight deepened into darkness, Beth realized this was just the beginning of uncovering a truth that would likely change not just how she saw her aunt, but possibly her entire family history. Whatever secret Rose had kept for 30 years before even writing it down was clearly one with profound implications. Beth closed the notebook and looked up at the stars appearing in the night sky. Somewhere in those pages lay a secret that Rose had finally decided needed to be known. And Beth was now its keeper. Beth barely slept that night. The blue notebook sat on her nightstand, its presence almost physical in the darkness. She had stopped reading after those first shocking pages, needing time to process what she'd learned. The woman who had baked her birthday cakes and taught her to knit had been living a lie. But why? Morning came with pale light filtering through the curtains of Rose's guest room. Beth had decided to stay at the farmhouse for a few days to sort through her aunt's belongings. Now, that task took on new meaning. She made a cup of coffee and returned to the porch swing, opening the notebook where she had left off. "I chose this small town carefully," Rose had written. "Far enough from my past that no one would look for me here, but not so remote that a newcomer would draw too much attention. The house at the edge of town was perfect, affordable and in need of someone to love it. The elderly owner seemed relieved to sell to a young nurse who promised to maintain the garden he and his late wife had planted together. I paid in cash, using money I'd slowly withdrawn over months. No paper trail. No questions." Beth paused, looking out at that very garden, now bursting with spring blooms. Had every daffodil and tulip been part of Rose's elaborate escape plan? A beautiful distraction from whatever she was hiding from? She continued reading. "The hospital was glad to hire me. Small towns always need medical staff. My falsified credentials held up to their minimal background check. Each day I remind myself of my new history, the childhood in Cincinnati that never happened, the nursing school I never attended. The lie becomes more natural with each telling. But at night, when I'm alone, I still hear her voice. I still see her face. I still wonder if what I did was unforgivable." Beth's hands trembled slightly. Who was this, her, that haunted Rose? What had her gentle, soft-spoken aunt done that she considered potentially unforgivable? The journal entries continued, detailing Rose's first year in town. How she kept to herself but was friendly enough not to arouse suspicion. How she volunteered at church functions but avoided close friendships. How she jumped at unexpected knocks on the door. Then came an entry that made Beth catch her breath. I saw someone who looked like him today. Just a glimpse through the drugstore window, but my heart nearly stopped. It wasn't him, of course. He wouldn't know to look for me here, and even if he did, he wouldn't recognize me now. I've cut my hair short and dyed it a different color. I wear glasses I don't need. I've changed the way I walk, the way I speak. Still, I couldn't make myself enter the store. I drove 30 miles to the next town to buy what I needed. Paranoia is the price of my freedom. Beth set the notebook down and walked into the kitchen. She opened the old photo album that had always sat on Rose's bookshelf. The earliest photos were from the late 1950s, showing Rose when she first moved to town. Beth had always thought of these as pictures of a young Aunt Rose, but now she realized they were pictures of someone else entirely, someone reinventing herself. In the photos, Rose looked different than in the attic photograph with the key. Her hair was indeed shorter, her posture more rigid. Even her smile seemed practiced. Beth had always attributed the stiffness in these old photos to the formal photography style of the era, but now she saw fear in those eyes. Watchfulness. Back on the porch, Beth continued reading. The entries became less frequent as Rose settled into her new life. There were mentions of holidays spent alone, of declining invitations that might lead to questions about her past, of careful responses when asked about family. Then, an entry from 1963, 5 years after Rose's arrival in town. I received a letter today. Plain envelope, no return address. Inside, just a newspaper clipping about the 5-year anniversary. No note, but I know who sent it. They want me to know they haven't forgotten. They're still looking. I burned it immediately, but the ashes feel like they're everywhere in this house now. I've scrubbed the floors twice. Tomorrow I will repaint the kitchen. Change things. Make it harder to find the woman I was. Beth looked up from the journal, suddenly aware of the kitchen's pale yellow walls. Rose had repainted that kitchen almost every year for as long as Beth could remember. Family members had teased her about her restlessness, her need for change. None of them had realized she was erasing herself, over and over again. The next entry was nearly a year later. I met someone today who knows about gardening. His name is Frank, and he suggested plants that might do well along the north fence. I found myself talking to him longer than I should have. It's been so long since I allowed myself a real conversation. He asked if he could stop by again to see how the new plants are doing. I said yes before I could remind myself why I shouldn't. Loneliness is a dangerous weakness. Beth smiled despite herself. She remembered Uncle Frank, Rose's husband of nearly 40 years, who had passed away about a decade before Rose. A quiet, gentle man who had adored Rose and never seemed bothered by her occasional withdrawal into silence. Had he ever known her secret? Had she eventually trusted him enough to tell him? The journal entries became even more sporadic after Frank entered the picture. There were mentions of inner conflicts, the desire to confess everything against the fear of losing him if she did. Then, a particularly moving entry, Frank asked me to marry him today. I said I needed time to think, but what I really need is courage. If I say yes, I'm promising a lifetime of lies, or the greatest risk I've ever taken. If I say no, I'm condemning myself to the loneliness I created. Is it selfish to want happiness after what I've done? Beth closed the notebook, needing a moment. She walked into the living room where photos of Rose and Frank's small wedding sat in silver frames. They looked happy, but now Beth could see the shadow in Rose's eyes even on what should have been her happiest day. What secret could be so terrible that it haunted her aunt even as she built a new life? Beth returned to the porch and opened the notebook again, determined to understand the woman who had been both so familiar and, she now realized, a complete stranger. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch as Beth continued reading. Rose had said yes to Frank's proposal, and for a while, the journal entries took on a lighter tone. She wrote about their small wedding, the honeymoon trip to the coast, and the careful way Frank respected her boundaries, never pushing when she said certain topics were off-limits, never questioning the absence of family on her side at their wedding. "Frank knows I'm keeping something from him," Rose wrote a year into their marriage. "He doesn't pry, but sometimes I catch him watching me when I jump at unexpected sounds or when I refuse to have our picture in the local paper. Last night, he simply said, 'Whenever you're ready to tell me, I'll be here.' I almost told him everything then. The words were right there, pushing against my lips. But then the phone rang, and the moment passed. I wonder if I'll ever be brave enough to risk losing him with the truth." Beth got up to stretch her legs, walking through the house that held so many memories, now all cast in a different light. She remembered holiday gatherings where Rose would tense up when strangers came to the door. How she never wanted her picture taken at community events. How she declined to attend Frank's company parties in the city. Little things that had seemed like quirks now revealed themselves as careful self-preservation. For 30 years, Rose had maintained this vigilance. What could be so dangerous that she never felt safe enough to let it go? Beth returned to the journal, finding an entry from the late 1960s, "I saw my name in the newspaper today." My real name. Not in our local paper. Frank had brought home a city newspaper left behind by a customer at his hardware store. Just a small mention in an article about unsolved cases. "After all these years, I'm still listed as missing. There's still a question mark where my life should be." Frank found me staring at it, and I barely had time to fold the paper before he came over. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. If only he knew how close to the truth that was. Beth realized she'd been holding her breath. Rose's real name had been right there in a newspaper Frank had brought home. A name Beth still didn't know. She flipped through the chest items again, looking for the newspaper clipping mentioned, but couldn't find it. Rose must have destroyed it, like she had destroyed the anonymous letter. The next entry came after a significant gap, 10 years in this town, in this life, and sometimes I almost believe it myself. Almost forget who I was before. Then something triggers a memory, a song on the radio, a certain shade of lipstick in a magazine, the way someone laughs, and it all comes rushing back. The hospital. The blood. The choice I made in a moment of desperation. Would I make the same choice now? I don't know. What I do know is that the consequences follow me like a shadow, growing longer with each passing year. Beth closed her eyes, trying to piece together these fragments. A hospital. Blood. A desperate choice. Was Rose running from the law? Had she harmed someone? It seemed impossible to reconcile with the gentle woman who had nursed injured birds back to health and donated half her garden's produce to the local food pantry. The journal continued with entries about Rose and Frank's life together. Their inability to have children, something Rose wrote about with a mix of sadness and what seemed like relief. "Sometimes I think it's for the best," she'd written. "What right do I have to bring a child into a life built on lies? What would I tell them about their family history, their grandparents? Every question would lead to more deception. Still, when I see Frank watching the neighborhood children play, I feel the weight of yet another thing I've taken from him." Beth had never known Rose and Frank had wanted children. As Rose's niece, she had often been treated almost like a daughter, especially during summer visits to the farm. Had she been a substitute for the children they couldn't have? Or had Rose been trying to give her something she herself had lost? A sudden realization struck Beth. If Rose wasn't actually her aunt, if Rose wasn't even her real name, then what was their true relationship? Was Beth even related to her at all? The next significant entry came from 1975, Frank knows. Not everything, but enough. It happened so unexpectedly. We were watching the news, and there was a story about a woman who had disappeared, leaving behind her family. The reporter called it a mysterious abandonment. Frank turned to me and said, "I've always wondered if that's what happened to you, if you left someone behind when you came here." The look in his eyes told me he'd suspected something all along. I started crying and couldn't stop. I told him I hadn't abandoned anyone who needed me, that it was the opposite. That I'd left to protect someone. He held me for hours and didn't ask for more details. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said. "I know who you are now, and that's what matters to me." I don't deserve his understanding, but I'm grateful for it every day. Beth wiped away tears. That sounded like the Uncle Frank she remembered, kind, patient, accepting. But Rose's words raised even more questions. Who had she been protecting by disappearing? And from what? The journal entries became more sparse through the late 1970s and early 1980s, mostly brief notes about garden successes and community events. Rose seemed to have settled into her life with Frank, the acute fear fading into a more manageable wariness. Then, in 1988, 30 years after Rose's arrival in town, came an entry that made Beth sit up straight. "I saw her today. After all these years, I came face to face with the past I've been running from. She's grown now, a woman, not the child I last saw. She was visiting the hospital where I work, accompanying an elderly patient. She looked right at me, and for a moment, I thought she recognized me despite the 3 decades and all the changes in my appearance. My heart nearly stopped. But then she simply asked for directions to the cafeteria, and I realized I'm truly a ghost to her now. As I should be. She looked happy, healthy. My sacrifice gave her that, at least. Tonight, for the first time, I'm writing down the whole story, not just fragments of memory and fear. It's time to record the truth, even if I'm the only one who ever reads it." Beth's hands trembled as she turned the page, finally about to learn the secret Rose had kept for 30 years. But to her dismay, the next several pages had been torn out of the journal. In their place was a folded note, "The truth is in the red box beneath the rose garden. When you're ready." Beth looked out toward the garden, the sky now turning dusky purple. Uncle Frank had built a rose garden for Rose on their 10th anniversary, a special section of the larger garden, with a stone bench and trellises. Beth had played there as a child, never knowing what secret lay beneath those blooming flowers. As darkness fell, Beth knew she would need daylight to search for the red box. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight was for questions. Who was the woman Rose had seen at the hospital? What sacrifice had Rose made for her? And what truth was so painful or dangerous that it had to be buried in the earth rather than written in the pages of a journal? Beth woke before dawn, the first gray light seeping through the curtains. Sleep had come in restless bursts, her dreams filled with faceless women and buried secrets. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the rose garden. In just a few hours, she would unearth whatever Rose had hidden there, the truth that had shaped both their lives in ways Beth was only beginning to understand. While waiting for full daylight, Beth returned to the wooden chest from the attic. She carefully examined each item, hoping for more clues. Among the photographs of strangers was one that caught her attention, a black and white image of a young woman in a nurse's uniform. The woman wasn't Rose, at least not the Rose that Beth knew. She had darker hair arranged in a professional style, and her posture was confident, almost proud. On the back, written in faded ink, "First day at Memorial, 1956. No name." There was also a small jewelry box containing a single item, a silver locket on a delicate chain. Inside was a tiny photo, weathered with age, of what appeared to be a baby. Beth held it under the lamp, trying to make out details, but the image was too small and faded. She placed it around her neck, feeling a strange connection to this unknown child who seemed to be at the center of Rose's secret. As the sun finally rose, Beth gathered a garden trowel and headed out to the rose garden. The morning was cool and damp, dew clinging to the grass and rose petals. The garden was arranged in a circular pattern with the stone bench at one end. Frank had built it with such care, had he known what lay beneath? Beth knelt on the ground, unsure where to begin. The rose garden was substantial, with dozens of bushes. Then she noticed something: the bench aligned perfectly with a large white rose bush at the opposite end of the circle. The white roses had always been Rose's favorites. Beth walked to that bush and began to dig carefully around its base. The earth was surprisingly loose, as if it had been disturbed more recently than the 30 years mentioned in the journal. About a foot down, her trowel hit something solid. Beth brushed away the soil with her hands, revealing a small red metal box. It was weathered but intact, sealed with a small padlock. For a moment, Beth just stared at it. Here, finally, were the answers she'd been seeking. She carried the box to the bench, turning it over in her hands. There was no key visible. Then she remembered the locket around her neck. On a hunch, she removed it and examined it more closely. The back had a small, unusual indentation that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't a locket at all, it was a key, disguised as jewelry. With trembling hands, Beth inserted the end of the necklace into the padlock. It fit perfectly, turning with a soft click. She took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside was a sealed envelope, several official-looking documents, a newspaper clipping, and a smaller envelope containing what appeared to be a hospital identification badge. Beth opened the sealed envelope first, finding several handwritten pages in Rose's familiar script. "My dearest Beth," the letter began. Beth's heart skipped a beat. Rose had known it would be her who found this. "If you're reading this, then you've discovered my journal and followed the path I left for you. I've struggled for years with whether I should take my secret to the grave or leave behind the truth for someone to find. In the end, I couldn't bear the thought of no one ever knowing who I really was, who you really are to me." Beth's hands shook so badly she had to put the letter down for a moment. "Who you really are to me." What did that mean? She continued reading. "My real name is Catherine Louise Winters. I was born in 1935 in a small town outside of Chicago. The nurse's badge in this box was mine, from when I worked at Memorial Hospital in the maternity ward. I loved that job, helping bring new lives into the world, supporting mothers through their most vulnerable and joyful moments. That's what makes the choice I made both ironic and perhaps unforgivable. In 1957, I fell in love with a doctor at the hospital, Thomas Reed. He was charming, brilliant, and, I later discovered, married. When I confronted him, he swore he was separated, in the process of divorce. I believed him because I wanted to. When I discovered I was pregnant, he initially seemed supportive, promised we would build a life together. Then his wife appeared at my apartment one night, revealing not only was their marriage intact, but she had political connections through her father that would ensure Thomas's promising career continued uninterrupted. What happened next still haunts me. Thomas and his wife offered me money to take care of the problem and disappear. When I refused, the threats began. Thomas's father-in-law was not only politically connected but had ties to people who could make someone vanish without a trace. They made it clear, either I eliminated the evidence of Thomas's indiscretion, or they would eliminate me. I was terrified, alone, and desperate. I pretended to agree to their terms, took some of their money, and fled in the night. I staged evidence to suggest I had followed through with their demands, leaving behind personal items stained with animal blood in my apartment. Then Catherine Winters disappeared. What Thomas and his family didn't know was that I was determined to protect the life growing inside me. I traveled across the country, changing my name and appearance multiple times before settling in this town as Rose Miller. 3 months later, I gave birth to a baby girl in a small clinic 2 counties over, where I'd made arrangements with a sympathetic doctor who agreed to keep no official records of my real identity. The hardest day of my life was when I placed that perfect baby girl into the arms of a kind couple who couldn't have children of their own. Your parents, Beth. The couple who raised you. Beth dropped the letter, her vision blurring with tears. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The world seemed to tilt beneath her. Aunt Rose wasn't her aunt at all. She was her mother. Her biological mother. After several minutes, Beth picked up the letter again with unsteady hands. I couldn't keep you, not then. They would have found us both. But I couldn't bear to be completely separated from you either. So I took the greatest risk of my new life. I befriended your adoptive mother through church volunteer work. When she learned I was a nurse, she asked for advice about baby care. That connection grew into a friendship. They never knew who I really was, never suspected I was anything other than a kind neighbor who adored their little girl. Watching you grow from a distance was both my greatest joy and my deepest pain. Every milestone I missed as your mother, I celebrated as your aunt. When your parents allowed you to visit me during summers, those weeks were the happiest of my life. Frank eventually figured out you were special to me, though I never told him you were my daughter. He simply said, that child has your smile, and never mentioned it again. Beth looked up from the letter, across the garden to the farmhouse where she had spent so many happy summer days. All those times Rose had brushed her hair, taught her to bake, held her when she cried over skinned knees or hurt feelings, her birth mother had been right there, loving her in the only way she safely could. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway startled her. Beth quickly gathered the box contents and hurried back to the house, the world around her forever changed by what she now knew. Beth hurried into the house, clutching the red box and its contents. Through the front window, she saw her cousin James getting out of his car. Rose's nephew, or at least, that's who Beth had always thought he was. Now she wondered about all the family connections she had taken for granted. Were any of them real? Beth? You still here? James called as he entered the house. In the kitchen, she answered, hastily tucking the red box into a cabinet. Her hands were still covered with garden soil, and she quickly washed them at the sink. James appeared in the doorway, his face tired. At 55, he was the oldest of what Beth had always considered her cousins. The lawyer called. They're reading Aunt Rose's will tomorrow. Thought I'd come by to let you know. Beth nodded, avoiding his eyes. Thanks. I've been going through some of her things. What would James think if he knew the truth? That Rose wasn't really his aunt either. Or was she? Beth realized she didn't know how far the deception went, how much of the family history she knew was real. You look like you've seen a ghost, James said, echoing the words Frank had spoken to Rose decades earlier. You okay? Just tired, Beth managed. It's been a lot to process. After James left with a promise to pick her up for the lawyer's appointment the next day, Beth returned to Rose's letter. There were still several pages she hadn't read. The newspaper article in this box, the letter continued, is from 1958. It reports on the disappearance of Catherine Winters, a nurse who vanished under suspicious circumstances. The investigation initially focused on foul play, but eventually shifted when evidence suggested I had obtained an illegal abortion and fled due to shame or guilt. That narrative served Thomas and his family perfectly. No one looked too deeply into a fallen woman who had taken care of her mistake. No one except Detective Michael Harris, whose card is also in this box. He never believed the official story, kept investigating long after the case went cold. Over the years, I lived in fear he would find me, expose my new life, and lead Thomas's family to us. What I never anticipated was that Detective Harris was investigating not to punish me, but because he suspected Thomas and his family of other wrongdoing. I learned this only in 1988, when I saw you at the hospital accompanying your father after his heart attack. That same day, an elderly man approached me in the parking lot. It was Harris, retired by then but still carrying my case file. He'd recognized me despite the years and changes. Catherine Winters, he said, and my world stopped. But instead of arresting me, he told me he knew why I'd run, had pieced together enough of the truth to understand I'd been threatened. Thomas's father-in-law had been investigated for connections to several disappearances over the years, women who had created problems for powerful men. Harris believed I was lucky to have escaped alive. He gave me his card, told me he could help if I ever wanted to come forward, to reclaim my real identity. I never called him, too afraid of upsetting the life I'd built, of losing you and Frank. But after that day, I began writing down my full story, preparing for a time when the truth might finally be told. That time is now, Beth. Beth set down the letter and pulled out the detective's card. It was weathered, the ink faded, but the phone number was still visible. Was Harris even alive after all these years? Did he still have information about Thomas Reed and his family? She continued reading. I don't know what you'll do with this truth, Beth. Perhaps you'll be angry that I deceived you all these years, that I was right there but never told you I was your mother. I would understand that anger. Perhaps you'll want to investigate Thomas Reed, to confront your biological father if he's still alive. I wouldn't blame you for that either, though I caution you about the power his family still might hold. What I hope, more than anything, is that you can understand I made the best choices I could in impossible circumstances. Every decision was to protect you, to give you a safe and happy life, even if it couldn't be with me. Your adoptive parents were wonderful people who loved you completely, that, at least, was never a lie. There's one more thing you should know. The money Thomas's family gave me to disappear, I saved most of it, investing it carefully over the years. Frank helped me, thinking it was an inheritance I rarely mentioned. That money has grown substantially. I've left it all to you in my will, under a special provision the lawyer will explain. It's your birthright, in a way. A small justice for what was taken from us both. Whatever you decide to do with this truth, know that I have loved you every day of your life, first with the fierce protection of a mother in danger, then with the quiet devotion of someone who found a way to keep you in her life against all odds. You were always my greatest joy, Beth. Always. With all my love, Catherine, your Rose. Beth sat at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face, the letter clutched in her hands. Outside, twilight was falling, shadows lengthening across the garden where she had just unearthed her own history. She felt hollow and full at once, empty with the shock of everything she'd believed being upended, yet filled with the knowledge that she had been so deeply loved, so carefully protected. She picked up the newspaper clipping from the box. The headline read, "Local nurse still missing after 3 months." There was a photo of Catherine Winters, young, smiling, eyes bright with a future she couldn't possibly have imagined. Beth could see herself in that face, the shape of the eyes, the curve of the smile. How had she never noticed the resemblance before? The hospital ID badge showed the same young woman, more formally posed. Catherine Louise Winters, RN, Memorial Hospital. Her mother. Not the woman who had raised her, Beth still thought of her adoptive mother with love and gratitude, but the woman who had given her life twice, first by bringing her into the world, then by giving her up to save her. Beth reached for her phone, then hesitated. Who would she call? What would she say? I just found out my aunt was really my mother who fled for her life while pregnant with me, wasn't exactly casual conversation. Besides, she needed time to process this herself before sharing it with anyone else. She looked at Detective Harris's card again. After more than 30 years, the number was surely disconnected. But there might be records, police files, evidence of what Thomas Reed and his family had done. Beth's biological father might still be alive, a successful doctor who never knew his daughter had been born, or worse, a man who had been willing to have her and her mother eliminated to protect his reputation. As darkness fell completely, Beth made a decision. She would go to the will reading tomorrow. She would learn what Rose, Catherine, had left for her. And then she would decide whether to let the past rest or to seek answers from the people who had altered the course of her life before she was even born. She gathered the contents of the red box and Rose's journal and placed them carefully in her overnight bag. Whatever came next, she wouldn't leave these precious connections to her true history behind. Rose had waited 30 years for Beth to know the truth. Now Beth would have to determine what to do with it. Beth barely slept that night, her mind racing with questions and revelations. By morning, her eyes were puffy from crying, her thoughts a tangled web of memories being rewritten with new understanding. Every childhood visit to Rose's farm, every holiday gathering, every moment they had shared now carried double meaning, the visible relationship everyone saw and the invisible truth only Rose had known. The will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Wilson & Hayes, a small law firm in town. James picked her up as promised, commenting on her tired appearance but not pressing when she deflected his concern. Other family members were already at the office when they arrived, cousins and their spouses, all connected to Rose through her marriage to Frank, all unaware of the secret that had just upended Beth's world. Mr. Hayes, a gray-haired man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, welcomed them into the conference room. Mrs. Miller was very specific about her wishes, he explained as everyone settled into chairs around the polished table. Most of her estate is straightforward, the farm and its contents to be divided among family as detailed here. Beth listened numbly as Mr. Hayes outlined the distribution of Rose's property. The farmhouse would go to James, who had always loved it. Various family heirlooms and mementos were designated for specific relatives. Normal, expected bequests from a beloved aunt to her family members. There is, however, a special provision, Mr. Hayes continued, looking directly at Beth. Mrs. Miller established a separate trust some years ago, with specific instructions that it be revealed only after her passing. Ms. Elizabeth Parker, would you please remain after we've concluded the general will reading? This matter concerns you specifically. Beth nodded, avoiding the curious glances from the others. Did they sense something unusual was happening? Could they see the truth written on her face? After the formal reading concluded and the others had filed out with subdued conversations about practical matters, Beth remained seated at the conference table. James had offered to wait, but she assured him she could get a taxi back to the farm. When they were alone, Mr. Hayes retrieved a sealed envelope from his desk. Rose came to me about 15 years ago to establish this trust, he explained. She was very particular about its terms and the privacy surrounding it. I was to give you this letter along with the formal documentation. Beth accepted the envelope with trembling hands. The seal was embossed with a simple R, not for Rose, she now realized, but perhaps for the real woman behind the name. The trust contains a substantial amount of money, Mr. Hayes continued. Just over $2 million, accumulated through conservative investments over many years. Rose was quite insistent that this was meant solely for you, separate from the family inheritance. The formal documents explain the technical details, but essentially, the money is yours without restriction. $2 million. The money Thomas Reed's family had paid to make a pregnant nurse disappear, carefully grown over decades into something that might now help their daughter, the very person they had tried to erase before her birth. Did she ever explain why? Beth asked softly. Why just me? Mr. Hayes hesitated. She said only that it was righting an old wrong, and that you would understand when the time came. Rose was unusual in some ways. Very private. Frank once told me there were parts of her life she never spoke about, even to him. But whatever secrets she kept, her affection for you was always clear. Beth nodded, clutching the envelope. Thank you. Outside the law office, Beth sat on a bench in the small town square, opening Rose's final letter. My dearest Beth, it began, in the familiar handwriting that had signed so many birthday cards and notes tucked into care packages during Beth's college years. By now you've discovered the truth about who I am and who you are to me. The money Mr. Hayes has explained to you was always meant to be yours, a mother's provision for her child, even if I couldn't claim you openly. But there's something more I want you to know, something I couldn't put in the letter with the red box because I wasn't certain of it then. In 1996, I hired a private investigator to look into Thomas Reed. I needed to know if the threat he and his family posed was still real, especially after Detective Harris contacted me. What I learned was unexpected. Thomas Reed died in 1975 of a heart attack. His father-in-law had passed years earlier. The political dynasty they had been building crumbled when certain unethical dealings came to light after the old man's death. The family still had money, but their power and influence had diminished significantly. Most surprising was what the investigator found about Thomas's wife, Eleanor. She had divorced him in 1965, after having 2 children with him. In an interview for a local newspaper years later, she mentioned regrets about her early life, specifically the cruel way we treated someone who deserved better. The article didn't name me, but the timing aligned with our history. What this means, Beth, is that you likely have half-siblings out there. The investigator found their names, William and Diane Reed, born in 1960 and 1962. As of 1996, William was a professor at a university in Massachusetts, and Diane was a physician in Seattle. They would be your biological half-brother and half-sister. I chose not to contact them then. The revelation would have raised too many questions, exposed too many painful truths about their father. But I'm leaving this information for you to decide what to do with it. They might not know you exist, or they might have pieced together parts of the story from their mother's hints and regrets. There's one more thing. After I learned the threat was likely gone, I considered telling you the truth. Several times I came close, when you graduated college, when you got married, when your first child was born. Each time, I lost my nerve. The longer I waited, the harder it became to find the right words, the right moment to reshape your understanding of who we were to each other. Then, when you divorced and moved across the country with your children, I realized I might never find the perfect time. So I began preparing these materials, this truth, to find you after I was gone. Perhaps it was cowardice not to tell you face to face. Or perhaps it was one final act of protection, giving you the space to process this revelation without worrying about my feelings. Whatever you choose to do with this information, whether you reach out to your half-siblings, whether you share this with your children, whether you try to contact Eleanor Reed or Detective Harris for more answers, know that my love for you was the most honest thing in my complicated life. In becoming Rose, I lost much of Catherine, but I never lost my love for the daughter I carried. All my love, now and always, your mother. Beth folded the letter carefully, her mind reeling with this new information. Half-siblings. People who shared her blood but had grown up never knowing she existed. Did they have her eyes, her laugh? Did they know anything about their father's first love, the woman who disappeared? She pulled out her phone and searched for William Reed, Professor, Massachusetts. Several results appeared, including a faculty page with a photo. The man had her chin, her forehead. Her biological father's son, her brother. With hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, Beth called for a taxi to take her back to the farm. Tomorrow, she would begin sorting through Rose's belongings with new understanding. But tonight, she needed to decide whether to reach across the decades of silence and secrets to connect with the siblings she had never known she had. As the taxi drove through the town Rose had chosen as her hiding place, her sanctuary, Beth realized that the secret Rose had held for 30 years wasn't just about the past. It was also about the future, a future where Beth might build relationships with family she never knew existed, where her children might know their blood relatives, where the circle broken by fear and threat might finally be made whole again. 6 months after discovering the truth about Rose, Beth stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the moving truck pull away. The property had been sold, the proceeds divided among the family as Rose's will had dictated. Beth had kept only what was truly meaningful: photographs, Rose's gardening journal, the blue notebook that had started her journey, and of course, the red box with its precious contents. The last half-year had been a whirlwind of emotions and decisions. After weeks of consideration, Beth had written a careful email to William Reed, the half-brother she had discovered online. She had been vague at first, mentioning only that she believed they might be related through his father, Thomas, and asking if he would be open to a conversation. His response had come just hours later, eager, curious, almost as if he'd been waiting for her message his entire life. Their first phone call lasted 3 hours. William, who went by Will, had grown up hearing whispers about his father's past, sensing gaps in the family history. Eleanor, their mother, had told her children little until they were adults, and even then, only in fragments. She would sometimes say there was another side to the story of their early marriage, Will had explained. That Dad's family had done things she regretted being part of. But she never gave us details, just told us that actions have consequences that can echo across generations. That first conversation led to another, and then to video calls that included Will's sister Diane. Beth was startled by how much Diane resembled Rose, the same graceful hands, the same thoughtful pause before speaking. It was like seeing a piece of her mother living in someone who had never known her. Diane, a cardiologist in Seattle, had Thomas's analytical mind but, according to Eleanor, a compassion her father had often lacked. She had been more skeptical than Will at first, asking for evidence of Beth's claims. But when Beth shared photographs of young Catherine Winters alongside pictures of all three of them as adults, the resemblance was undeniable. "It's like looking at a family album I never knew existed," Diane had said, her voice catching. "All these years, we had a sister." It was Diane who had arranged for the three of them to meet Eleanor, now in her 80s and living in a retirement community in Florida. Beth had been terrified at the prospect of meeting the woman who had once threatened her mother, who had been part of the reason she grew up never knowing her biological mother's touch. But the Eleanor she met was not the cold, calculating woman from Rose's letters. Time had softened her. Regret had humbled her. "I've been waiting for this day," Eleanor had said when Beth was introduced to her. "Hoping for it, even. A chance to make right what can never truly be made right." In her sun-filled living room, Eleanor had told them her side of the story, how she had been just 22 when she married Thomas, how her father had controlled every aspect of her life, how she had been raised to believe that family reputation was worth any sacrifice. "When Thomas told me about the nurse he'd been involved with, my father took over completely," she explained. "I was barely consulted. He made the threats. He arranged for the money. Thomas went along with it to save his career, and I went along with it because I didn't know how to defy my father." Eleanor had wept when Beth showed her the photograph of young Catherine in her nurse's uniform. "I saw her once, you know. At the hospital, before everything happened. She was kind to me when I came in for a checkup, never knowing I was the wife. I remember thinking how lovely her smile was, how gentle her hands. And then months later, I was part of destroying her life." The strangest moment had been when Eleanor asked, tentatively, if Beth had any photographs of Rose in her later years. "I've always wondered what became of her, if she found happiness despite what we did." Beth had shown her pictures of Rose and Frank, of their garden, of Rose holding Beth's children, her grandchildren, though they never knew it. Eleanor had studied them with tears streaming down her face. "She built a beautiful life," she'd whispered. "Thank God for that, at least." Now, as Beth took one last look at the empty farmhouse before driving away, she felt the weight of the past 6 months, the shock, the grief, the anger, and finally, the tentative steps toward healing. She had gained a brother and sister. Her children had aunts and uncles and cousins they had never known existed. Family gatherings now included new faces that somehow felt familiar, with features and mannerisms that echoed her own. But the most profound change was within Beth herself. Understanding Rose's sacrifice had transformed her grief over losing her aunt into something more complex, mourning for the mother-daughter relationship they could have had openly, gratitude for the way Rose had kept herself in Beth's life against all odds, and awe at the courage it took to give up everything to protect her child. Beth touched the silver locket that now rarely left her neck, the key disguised as jewelry that had unlocked not just the red box, but her true history. Inside, she had placed a tiny photograph of Rose on one side and Catherine on the other, the two identities of the woman who had given her life and then shaped it from the shadows. Her phone buzzed with a text from Will, just checking in. "How are you holding up?" Beth smiled, still not entirely used to having a brother who checked in on her, who cared about her feelings, who was eager to make up for lost decades. She wrote back, "Just said goodbye to the farm. Harder than I expected. But ready for what comes next." What came next was still unfolding. Beth had used part of Rose's trust to establish a scholarship for nursing students at the hospital where Catherine had once worked. She was writing a memoir about Rose's life and her own discovery, changing names to protect privacy but keeping the essential truth intact. And next month, all three siblings were planning to visit Catherine's hometown together, to walk the streets she had walked, to see the hospital where she had worked, to piece together the beginnings of the remarkable woman who had connected them. As Beth drove away from the farmhouse for the final time, she thought about the extraordinary courage it had taken for a young, pregnant nurse to flee for her life, to rebuild everything from scratch, to exist within reach of the child she could not claim. Rose had held on to her secret for 30 years, carrying its weight alone. Now that weight was shared among all those whose lives had been shaped by that long-ago choice: Beth, Will, Diane, even Eleanor. The secret that had divided them had ultimately brought them together. The love that had been forced into hiding had finally emerged into the light, spanning generations and healing old wounds. Rose's final gift wasn't just the truth or the trust fund, it was the family that Beth had gained, the connections that had been waiting all along, unknown but real. Beth turned onto the main road, the farmhouse disappearing in her rearview mirror. But Rose, Catherine, stayed with her, in the locket against her heart, in the features she shared with her newfound siblings, in the strength she hadn't known she had until she learned where it came from. Some secrets, once revealed, don't break the world apart. They put it back together in ways you never imagined possible.